how would you tell someone to recognize an unhealthy spiritual environment?
The definition of consent and the difference between what we might call use or adultery and abuse between, adults.
From the outside, again, it looked completely toxic.
I don't think that's what Jesus's plan was. I think we got that wrong.
If you leave my church, you will be cursed.
And I told my wife when we got home, I said, nobody will tell me that that was not church this morning.
Sunday morning breakfast recommendation, Waffle House or IHOP?
Oh, without question, Waffle House.
Welcome to Project Healed. This is Bob and Erica Hazlett, and we're excited to have another episode. This will be one of our most challenging, but I think most helpful episodes. We're going to talk about victims of church abuse and sexual abuse. And today we have a guest we're super excited to have with us, Boz Tchividjian, who is or was a prosecutor, is an advocate, a lawyer, and one of the foremost advocates for victims of clergy abuse. He founded an organization called GRACE, which stands for a godly response to abuse in church environments. And so welcome, Boz. Thanks for coming here with us.
Bob, thanks for having me, and great to be here with the two of you.
We're really looking forward to this conversation. So my first question, I'm going to admit it's not an easy one, but when SA has happened in a church and you've represented a victim, I know that you've represented a lot of high-profile victims. What are the main barriers that you see as a response from church leadership when you're presenting what happened?
That's a good question. When we handle cases, they generally fall into two categories. One is child sexual abuse cases, and the other would be adult clergy abuse cases. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes churches respond differently depending on which one you bring up. So if when I say adult clergy abuse, I mean we're representing an adult who was in a vulnerable position in life and who was groomed by a clergy at the church. And ultimately that grooming developed into sexualized contact and ultimately continued abuse for an ongoing period of time. And in many jurisdictions, such conduct is not unlawful. It's not illegal. You can't be prosecuted for it, but it certainly would fall under the category of abuse, which we can talk about later. The other category was child sexual abuse. Obviously, in all jurisdictions, that's a crime. Mm-hmm. And so when we approach a church with regard to child sexual abuse, the natural response obviously is to take it serious because we're dealing with a crime. But the initial gut response, I find all too often, is the church's first and foremost response is about protecting itself as an institution and protecting those in leadership who might have played a role in failing to protect that particular victim. And so that's why oftentimes, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but first thing the church does is get a lawyer. The next thing we know, we're talking to lawyers, which again, is not necessarily a bad thing. Everybody's entitled to a lawyer. But what the challenge for me is that so many times I find church leaders utilize their lawyer to hide behind and let the lawyer do the dirty work while they sit there quietly and rationalize to us and themselves, we're just being told to do what the lawyer tells us. And when I get the chance, and I don't often get this chance, but when I get the chance to look at them and go, but what's more important? To do what God directs you to do or do what your lawyer tells you to do? And I'm not saying you don't follow your lawyer, but when that comes at the expense of causing further trauma and harm to this particular person who's already been harmed in your midst, there's a problem with that. And I think that was the same with adult clergy abuse. I think with adult clergy abuse, the pushback we often get is, that's just an adult relationship. Yeah, it was adultery, but you're making a bigger deal than it is. It's not abuse. And a lot of minimization of that. So with child sexual abuse, it's usually not minimization. It's either the child's not believable or we're going to do whatever our lawyers call us to do, and we hide behind that. With adult clergy abuse, it tends to be usually the gut reaction is it's not abuse. It's immoral, and the pastor, shouldn't have done that. But why is the lawyer contacting us, and why are you making a bigger deal of this than it is? But when you scrape below the surface on both of those, what's the ultimate objective there? Even if it's not being stated, it's the protection of the institution, self-protection, and that's why survivors often need legal advocates, because the church is not protecting them from abuse, and the church is not advocating for them when they come forward having reported abuse, sadly. So they come to me, and we will walk beside them and advocate on their behalf and with them. So oftentimes I have clients saying, the letter you sent to the church, even if nothing else comes from this case, the letter you sent from the church is the very first time another human being has advocated on my behalf with regard to this matter. And that alone is healing for me. And that's why we do what we do.
And that is a part of healing from sexual abuse of any kind, clergy or otherwise, is restorative justice.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where you've really pioneered in this area with all of the research that you did on the Bob Jones University, where you had your team interview, I think it was like 1,200 people.
A lot.
It was a lot, yeah. And that really showed, I thought, for the first time, what clergy SA can look like in a very, it was very out in the open, even though no one was allowed to talk about it. And I think that's one thing that we find with churches, unfortunately, is that people feel afraid to talk about it, whether that's because they feel afraid that if they spoke against a leader, that people who are encountering God or are being healed in that church or are having a good experience, that could stop. And I think that there's also a lot of fear that if they come forward, that they will be penalized or rejected or, punished in some way.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's a really hard issue to feel like, how do you empower victims to come forward? And I did work with child victims of human trafficking for over 12 years. And I know that even when you'd read all the reports and all of it was written, you'd read the police reports and you'd read all the things, the way that the story comes out from the child who's going through healing is not always the way we would like to see it as a social worker, as a leader. Like, it's not A, B, C, D, E. It's not always in this linear kind of form. Sometimes the story comes out in little bits and pieces. Sometimes there's revelation after someone else says, this is what I went through. And then someone says, wait, I went through that. I didn't even realize that was abuse. So what are some of the things that you do to help strengthen the voices of victims and advocate for them and give them the courage to keep standing?
So what you said earlier about their fears is very true. Those fears are legitimate, because so many survivors watch others who've stepped forward be marginalized, even vilified by church members. And so it's like you're already dealing with this trauma. The ones who are even thinking about stepping forward are ones who've actually processed enough to realize not only was this abusive, and not only was this oftentimes illegal, but I need to do something about it.
Yeah.
There are so many survivors. Let's not forget the untold number of survivors that will never say a word to a single soul the rest of their life.
That's right.
About the horror that was inflicted upon them.
Yes.
And there's so many various reasons why they won't. And so the ones who do decide, okay, I think I want to do something about this, but then they see what others have been through. They see that when someone steps forward and discloses being abused by a pastor, and how the church comes around the pastor and sees the pastor as the victim, and this victim as sort of the perpetrator, destroying this wonderful man's ministry, and everybody's sinful and we all have weaknesses, and they always try to equivocate. I can't tell you how many of my clients who've had children that were sexually abused in a church by a church leader, youth leader, come to me and say, what do we do? And I say, well, you need to you need to deal with this head on. And my guess is, I'm telling you right now, probably in 6 months you're not going to be a part of this church anymore. And many of them
Yeah.
that they, oh no, we've been with this church for years. They're like a church family. They're going to understand. And I usually say, okay, go call me back when and if something changes. And 9 out of 10 times I get a call back a few months later going, we don't even recognize this church. We're no longer a part of it. And so there, I cannot tell you how many of my clients are no longer part, and these are the victims, not perpetrators. Victims who are no longer part of that church, because of how the church responded. And so there is that fear. So one of my roles as a lawyer is, I share with just about every client that we have, is I can't guarantee you the outcome of this case. I can't guarantee you a monetary amount. It may be nothing. But my hope more than anything else is when you look back on this process, that you will be grateful that you took that step forward, because you will see this as part of your healing journey. And that's going to come with you regaining your agency, regaining your voice. And my role is to help you do that. I'm not going to be your voice. I'm going to help you with your voice. I'm not going to be your agency. I'm going to help you reclaim your agency. And so I tell clients, you're in the driver's seat in this case. Yes, I'm the lawyer and I'll give you advice and counsel on what I think you should do. But at the end of the day, you're in the driver's seat. You're coming to see me because other people have taken something from you and have not cared what you said and not cared about you or your voice. You're coming to me now because it's time for you to take that back. And I want this process to help you do that. And I think by and large, we're successful in doing that. Not necessarily always successful from the monetary standpoint, but having somebody look at me at the end of the process saying, I'm glad I went through it, because for the first time, I'm hearing my own voice again.
Wow.
And the sad thing is, why does it have to take a lawyer to do that? Shouldn't the church be the one coming alongside that survivor and doing those types of things? And sadly, that's a rarity these days.
Yeah.
We should be. The people that have the power to speak for those people, should be speaking. And I know you're saying this not just as an advocate and as a lawyer. You're saying this as a person who grew up in the church, loves the church, cares about faith community, and have been a voice of healing and a help of healing to a lot of people.
Well, let me correct you real quick. I'm not sure if I can say I love the church. I love Jesus, but the work I've done, I'm grappling with the whole love of the church of ours.
That's fair. And that's fair. Maybe our definition of church is changing. I know my ecclesiology is evolving, and I want to love what Jesus died for, right? But I'm not sure I see that right now. So let me redirect, because a couple of things you said are so powerful for me as a leader to hear. And I want people to be able to hear it, that you talked about how it's so important, the first thing that the voice that speaks up for a victim. You talked about that the church should be the one to be able to speak up and give a voice to people. And then you said there's a difference between abuse and child abuse and abuse. And reading some of your work, I wanted you to speak to that specific part where the definition of consent and the difference between what we might call use or adultery and abuse, between adults and the power differential. Can you speak to that and help us understand that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. So the best way to maybe frame this is, if a physician is having sexual contact with their patient, even if the sexual contact is consensual, we would all say, wow, there's a problem there. In fact, that physician probably would lose their license.
Yes.
The lawyer does that with a client. I know somebody who ended up, a lawyer, who ended up having consensual sexual contact with his client, and he lost his bar license. Why? Is it because it was forced, sexual assault? No, it's because there's a huge power differential between the doctor and the patient, the lawyer and the client. A therapist in Florida, if a therapist has sexual contact, even consensual sexual contact with a patient, it's a felony. It's a serious crime.
Yes.
So then you take a step back and go, okay, wait a minute. The world sees all these things as wrong and abusive because of the power differential, but somehow inside the church, where I think the position of a pastor in most churches is much more powerful and influential than a doctor, a
Yes.
lawyer, or a therapist.
Yes.
Because the pastor is the rep in many through many people's perspectives, the pastor or pastor on staff is a representative of God.
Yes.
And oftentimes the manner in which that pastor is grooming and abusing that congregant is through the use and misuse of scripture and that person's faith, unlike what a lawyer or a doctor or a therapist does. So
Yes.
it's in many ways the power differential is, to me, significantly greater than that. And that pastor is exploiting that position of power and influence, spiritual power and influence, over that congregant's vulnerabilities to groom them, to make them feel special, to highlight their weaknesses, and then to come in and be their savior, and then to almost immediately sexualize that relationship. That is the definition of abuse. And the good thing is, more and more state governments are realizing this. I mean, I didn't realize this until a couple of years ago. The state of Texas, if a pastor has sexual contact with somebody that's under his care or her care or supervision, it's a crime. That person under Texas law is incapable of consenting to that sexual contact with that pastor.
Good.
And therefore that pastor can be subject to being prosecuted for sexual battery. I think that's the way it should be in all 50 states.
It should be. It should be.
I agree.
And we're making progress with regard to that. But I hope that answers the question. It's not, because so many times the pat answer is it's adultery. It's wrong. It's sinful, but it's adultery. It's not adultery. It's abuse. And we have to, as a church, come to grips with that reality.
Yeah.
And there are too many people out there that struggle with understanding that. And part of it is just help us coming alongside of them and helping them understand and peel apart the definition. And when people understand, like I said, most people, if I tell them about a doctor having sexual contact with a patient, even the people who might be saying this is adultery over here in the church would say, oh yeah, that's wrong. Well, if we can help them understand that this is actually even a more powerful relationship,
Yes, it is.
perhaps we'll see some changes.
Thank you for being clear.
Yes. So I absolutely agree that this needs to be a law that we have in all 50 states. I think that there needs to be protections for people so that clergy SA is not permitted regardless of the age. And I think that that's really what the law I know in Georgia that was just passed is, so that if a member of clergy has an SA relationship with anyone of any age who was in their congregation, then that is actually a crime. And I think that's really important. Now, I would also really like to hear how you'd respond to this question. So I spoke to an older leader who is very respected, written many books. And the leader said, it wasn't that many years ago that people were going to their priests or to their pastors to tell their sins and disclose things, and that it was thought to be kept in like the most highest level of secrecy. How much do you think that is a factor in why churches have so failed in so many situations to protect the victim? Is it because, explain to me, when you're coming up with these, when you've got a huge abuse case, why are people so quick to circle around the pastor and say, no, we are going to make sure that this pastor and that this church are protected, even if there was a crime that was committed?
Yeah. Because largely in the American church, we have a cult of personality in our churches, in our evangelical churches. Think of it this way. I can't think of another profession that exists out there where once a week, a person, usually a man, will get up in front of a group. And in fact, it's not even that. Let's back up a little bit. The service starts, and the service all culminates with what? When I was growing up, the sermon culminated with the sermon, right? You have all this, you have the music, you have the doxology, you have the offering, announcements, and then you have the sermon. And then you have this man will get up and speak for, if you're lucky, 30 minutes. If you're not so
Yeah.
lucky like I was in some of my churches, like an hour.
Yeah.
And most people are just affirming it, taking notes. Nobody's interrupting. We're creating these monsters.
Yeah.
They're narcissistic, and if they're not narcissists to begin with, they are
They
by the
become.
time they're done. And if usually they're a little bit narcissistic to begin with, and we're just fueling that narcissism, and so that person becomes the church. One of the things I do like about the Episcopal and Anglican and even Orthodox traditions and Catholic, to be honest, is when you go to an Episcopal service, the service culminates not in the sermon. In fact, the sermon is like 10 minutes. The service culminates in the Eucharist.
Eucharist.
Jesus.
Yeah.
It's culminating not in some guy in tight jeans speaking for 30, 40, 50 minutes and trying to get, thinking that they're all wonderful and all this. No, it culminates with Jesus.
The table.
So
Yeah.
I think that's a huge problem. So when you begin to speak up against that person, you are now the problem. Because how dare you speak up against that person? This person is being used by God. Look at the way the church has grown and how successful we've been and the money we've brought in. Obviously, we have God's favor, and you are out to destroy God and this church because of what it's doing. We see that all of the time. And what I found in evangelical Christianity, because I grew up in it, is it's very dualistic. It's us versus them. And when you're part of us, you don't want to be one of them.
Yeah.
And so the moment somebody speaks up and says, wait a minute, what happened here is wrong. It's very easy for these leaders who have a cult-like following to make you one of them.
Yeah.
And now you are without community, and everybody in that church community sees that. They don't want to be like that person and be one of them. They want to stay one of us. And the best way you do that is to come alongside of the pastor, see this pastor as the true victim, because the pastor is being persecuted by this particular person for the godly work that he's doing, which is a bunch of bunk, but people buy it by the droves.
Wow. Thank you for being so plain spoken. I didn't know we were going to have such a great conversation. I love it. I don't want you to feel like you do, because I feel like a lot of people on a similar journey, I can relate to this journey, kind of reconstructing ecclesiology. Several years ago, things happen, in church communities I was a part of that made me go back to my roots, which is more Wesleyanism. Wesleyan was an Anglican, definitely centered around the Eucharist, around the table. And Wesley had to come in at a time of where the church was blowing up and actually brought a reformation of spiritual formation. So real spiritual formation doesn't happen on a Sunday morning. And thank you for saying that. And we receive it. And we hope that people can hear that there are things that were within the system actually that enable this, that need to be changed. I want to ask you, if you could, not that this isn't a great topic, because I love it, and I'd like to talk more about it with you, but I want you to put on your consultant hat, because part of what Grace does is actually help organizations do the right thing. That's my understanding. What are some of the things that churches should do whenever a revelation comes or an exposure comes? What are the things they should do whenever that happens? What's the right thing to do?
Yeah, and just for clarity's sake, I know we mentioned earlier I started Grace, which I did. When I decided to go back and do this line of work full time, I stepped down from Grace. I don't have any formal association with them today. But having said that, we often are asked, okay, what do we do? And I think part of it's before you even ask what do you do, it's trying to say, what's your mindset? Where's your heart in all this? When you hear about something like this, is your heart of the church immediately grieved that a person in your flock has stepped forward claiming that they've been profoundly hurt? And is it being grievous over it, and then being humble to go, before we start saying, what do we do? And how do we protect us, to go, we lament over this.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity for us to show the love of Christ to this person, even if it requires us great sacrifice as a church. And that requires humility.
Yeah.
And so many churches struggle with that today. What happens, I have found in the church, is we preach the gospel, which is in its sum, that God, the God of the universe, has given up himself, has sacrificed himself in order to protect and save the individual.
Yeah.
But what happens when these situations occur is the churches that preach that actually do the complete opposite. They require that person to be sacrificed in order for the institution to be protected and safe.
Wow.
And we have to understand that difference. Once you have a church leadership that begins to understand that, then we can start talking about, okay, what do you do? What are the whats? So, we could talk all afternoon about that, but one of them is, what have you done as a church to learn from experts on this issue and to create a DNA of your church that is all about protecting vulnerable people where they are and having zero tolerance for those in power that abuse them or exploit them? It has to be part of the very DNA of who you are. It's not just a matter of taking an online class, checking off a few boxes and saying, okay, we're a child-safe environment, which happens all the time because lots of organizations are out there making a lot of money selling that type of stuff to churches in a false sense of security, and also a little bit of an arrogance. Oh, we do this program or we do this program. You don't start there. You start with going, we don't know anything. Like I tell pastors all the time, you went to seminary. If you want to talk and preach about theology and the gospel, great. You're going to do a way better job than I can do on that. But you haven't spent the last 30 years on the front lines addressing abuse, especially abuse issues within faith communities. So go to those people who have that experience. Even if they're not Christians, who cares? Like, go learn from these people that God places in your path. And if it requires you as a church to sacrifice your time, your talents, all of these things in order to help develop that environment and community, then by all means do it. Because if children and vulnerable people in our churches are not protected, I don't know what our church is all about, because Jesus had the most beautiful things to say and do towards those that everybody else overlooked. And to the children. And if we're not mirroring that in some fashion at the heart of our churches, then why are we calling ourselves a church? What are we doing?
Yes. I know that you have represented some of the highest profile clergy essay cases, including the International House of Prayer, Kansas City, and Robert Morse's victim, Cindy Clemshire. I visited the International House of Prayer, Kansas City. If you guys aren't familiar with what happened there, I understand, but it was a very high profile case where there turned out to be many victims. And I visited IHOP Casey many times, and I encountered God there, and I had good experiences there. And when I started to find out how many people were involved in abuse, fraudulence with the prophetic, I was so sad. I remember Bob would just come into the kitchen and I would be weeping. Like I just could not believe how desecrated the church of the temple of God had become. And so I would really like to hear about how you process even that situation, like finding out. To me, it seemed like, at least on the outside, layer after layer, and shortly after the announcement was made, at the very beginning, one of my friends said, "Erica, you know one of the main victims very well," and I do, and it was devastating for their family, the abuse that took place. So how do you process this layer by layer? Or I guess even how would you tell someone to recognize an unhealthy spiritual environment? Because that was, by the end, it was just, from the outside, again, it looked completely toxic.
Yeah, in some ways, those are sort of separate questions. I mean, when it gets to IHOP and organizations like that, I didn't know anything about IHOP. It's not the world I grew up in. I thought IHOP was a place you get pancakes. Yeah. And quite frankly, I think the place to get pancakes is a lot healthier. I never thought I'd say it's a healthy place.
Oh gosh, I think you're right. And that's
than the one that professes to be a church. But the more I got into a church like that, and again, this is coming from an outsider, and I know it did a lot of people had many beautiful experiences there. So I don't take
Mhm.
that away. But the more I dug deeper into that environment, the more I realized how really toxic it was in
Yes.
so many levels. It was just, this is not a very good word to describe. It was just weird. And I'm
Yeah.
like, and I'm just like, and sometimes when you're in a church that is like that, you don't really notice it until you're away from it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tell you. We were part of a couple churches. I won't mention names, but where we were heavily involved. I was an elder in both of them, and it wasn't until we had some distance between us and those churches that my wife and I would talk about. Man, I can't believe we were part of that place. Like this
Yeah.
and this and this. Like, why didn't we
Yeah.
see it then? Because you're not looking for it. You're so wrapped up in community. Church is all about
Yes.
community. And one of the things, like a church like IHOP or any of these other churches that we can talk about, people primarily, when you were involved at IHOP, that was your almost exclusive community.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't really do much life outside of IHOP,
That's right.
which makes you question, like, I don't think that's what Jesus's plan was. Any disciples just hang out together and be
Exactly.
together and don't do anything else, and certainly don't go out there. Just hang out together and pray 24 hours a day, and that's all we need you to do.
Yes.
I think we got that wrong. And so when you're part of that, though, it's comfortable, it's affirming, it feels very spiritual and godly, even though you have all this toxicity going on. And I think a lot of these leaders, these bad eggs, they know that, and they know how much they can manipulate the flock in whether it's abuse, covering things up, controlling other people, convincing them that their concerns are not legitimate, especially people who have a spiritual power and influence. And I think that's what happened at IHOP. I think we saw that at Willow Creek as well with Bill Hybels, is this whole creating these cultures where this community is about your only community, and you don't want to ever lose it. And you look up to these people as godlike figures. And then those people and those institutions begin to control more and more and more of what you do, sometimes even what you think. You lose your individuality, and you're okay with it because you're part of that community. And I think what it does to me is I see a lot of the gross underbelly of the church and the work we do.
Yes.
And that, I'd be lying to you if I tell you that I didn't struggle with that. My wife and I usually go to Waffle House on Sunday mornings, and I can tell you that, and people can judge me for what they want, but a couple months ago, I came home from one of those Waffle House, and we got to know all the servers and everybody. And they share some of their struggles with us. And I told my wife when we got home, I said, nobody will tell me that was not church this morning.
Yeah.
Nobody. I felt way more at church this morning than I did 5 years ago at this church that I was an elder at. And this is at Waffle House. And the older I get, I realize, like, I think that's where Jesus hung out, and there was church wherever he was present. And so that gives me the hope for my own faith. My faith is radically changed in probably the last 10 years, but it also gives me the hope in Jesus, because I don't think Jesus would really be at home in the IHOPs and the Willow Creeks and the First Baptists of this world. I just don't.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean,
Well-
hearing you say that, first of all, as someone who was very involved with a lot of these movements, it's like, it's such an unlearning. Like,
Right.
I've attended healthy churches, and I have attended some very toxic churches.
Yeah.
And, now when I attend a church, I feel like I'm a little bit faster to say, that is a little weird. Just like you just said it. Like I can now, I'm now more like, I'm not turning off the critical thinking as much as I was,
Right.
to
Yeah.
where and now when I'm looking back, it's like, oh, there was this and there was this and there was this. So
Right.
maybe it actually wasn't as hidden. And that is one thing that I've learned. I have my master's degree in social work, and I have been an advocate for victims for many years. It's been a primary career. But
Thank you, by the way, for doing that.
thanks. I appreciate that. It has definitely been a painful journey. I understand your journey of pain.
Sure.
But one of the things that I've really recognized is that when abusers continue to abuse, their behavior actually escalates,
Yeah.
and it becomes more and more brazen. And so it's almost like they think they're getting away with it more. And often there's a justification like, well, I am just handsy with everyone. I give everybody a high five. I give everyone this. And then they get away with that. And then there's, there might be children, there might be, and then it just escalates. And what I've seen, and actually I've studied and researched, is that is actually part of the that SA addiction process, is that you're going to see an escalation of that behavior, that it's not just going to get healed on its own.
No, and it's all about control. And that control gets to the point where you can't even question that leader. Because if you question that leader, you're questioning God. And that leader gets to the point where they realize, and oftentimes it's true, that the rules don't apply to them. And they've created now an environment in a community and those around them that affirm that. The rules just don't apply to them. They apply to everybody else.
Yeah.
But they don't apply to them. And that creates what you've just described. And that means they get more brazen and get more explicit with their conduct and their control and all the above, until something finally breaks. And it's funny because these guys, mostly guys, but there are females are in this category too, but these guys they're so narcissistic, they don't believe, even though they could read their history books and see what happens to so many other pastors, that eventually, most of the time, not all the time, but eventually something will break and then it'll implode. But man, they don't think that way. They're the exception. And it's not going to happen to them. And my job as a lawyer is to go, you know what? It's happening to you, because I'm going to make sure it does, because the law is going to hold you accountable for what you did to this person who has no less value in the eyes of God than you.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing, and thank you for what you're saying. And I think it is breaking through. I don't know if the words cognitive dissonance is right, but the fog that people feel when they're going through this, and they start to become aware of people that they thought were one way. Now they're starting to see them another way, or they're starting to recognize unsafe environments. Here's a question that I have. As a leader, I was in a church many years ago, and I was doing outside ministry, a lot of missions work. So I was just part of the church, not on staff. But I was threatened by a leader. It's specific words. If you leave my church, you will be cursed. And then threats were attached to that, of reputational harm, all kinds of things. Now, I was a powerful person. I feel powerful. I had powerful mentors and leaders that could come alongside of me, let my voice be heard, and they came alongside of my voice, and that I was able to navigate that. But I know there are people on staff that probably couldn't, and I still feel a little bit of pain that I couldn't help them or didn't help them at that time. I just didn't see. I don't know. But what would you say to someone that's on staff in a place of vulnerability and wants to be an advocate but can't? What could you say to them?
Yeah. Couple thoughts. Number one is that pastor 9 out of 10 times is way less powerful than you think.
Good point.
When you're part of that church in that environment, you think, man, this is he's the rock star of the church, and now he's making these threats to me. Oh my goodness.
That's
and
huge.
All you have to do is step out the door and go across the street, and you realize there's a large part of your community that has no clue who this pastor is, and it certainly aren't being influenced by him. So number one, far less influential and powerful than you think. And secondly is, if you're on staff and you're experiencing this from a leader or your pastor, remember this job is not a prison sentence. You can walk out, and you're probably going to have to, because if the pastor is that way, you're not going to change it. There might be those rare circumstances where that happens. But your best bet is to get out the door. And it's hard. It's easy. People say, well, that's easy for you to say, but this is this person's job and their career and all that.
Where
You
their
just got
kids go to
where their kids go to school. That's their community.
summer
Yeah,
Bible
like,
school.
yeah, I mean, it's just, this might make. So here's what happens: is like, well, if I make a bigger deal about this, as my heart's telling me I should, I risk everything, and it may even involve me having to pick up my family and move to a whole new place. Versus, I just need to suck it up.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
we all are called to carry our cross and our burdens, and so this is going to be my burden. And it's amazing how many church leaders convince underlings that to be the case. Like,
Yeah.
Mhm.
yeah, I know I'm a jackass, but you know what? That's part of just it's part of living the Christian life. You got to. Then we didn't say this is going to be easy, and people sadly they'll buy that
Yeah.
because the alternative is so significant. It's going to who wants to uproot your kids' lives?
Yeah.
All of those things. I get it,
Mhm.
but so but remembering, like, this is not a prison. I can go. The
Yes.
question
Mhm.
is, I have to make the decision. Do I just suck it up and ignore this?
Mhm.
Or do I go, it's time for me to begin looking? And the most of the time, the people who suck it up and ignore it only can do that for so much longer before they either sell out their soul
Yeah.
or they can't sleep at night because their conscience is troubling them so much that they go, I got to get out of here.
Yeah.
Okay, so if there was a victim sitting right here with us who had not yet talked about what happened to them, their experience, let's just say, or the parent of a victim. So you're talking to somebody over 18. Can you explain a little bit about what the court process would actually be like for them, and what that experience would be like? I'm sure there's got to be victims that are watching this and thinking, should I come forward? Should I tell what happened?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing I would say is helping people understand the difference between the criminal system and the civil system.
Mhm.
The criminal system involves the parties being the government, the state of Florida and the actual perpetrator, the one who committed the abuse. In the criminal system, the victim is not a party to the case. The victim really has very little control over that case. The prosecutor controls that case.
Okay.
But the ultimate outcome in a criminal case is punishment or incarceration of that particular person. But as we all know, abuse doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are oftentimes abusers who have been protected and put in places where they shouldn't have been put in, where they have been able to access their victims. And that's where the civil case comes in. The civil cases say, listen, you as a victim, you are actually going to be a party to this case, unlike the criminal case. In fact, it's going to be your case.
Mhm.
You are going to make the decisions in this case. And yes, you can sue the perpetrator, but you're also going to hold accountable the institutions that protected that perpetrator or put him or her in that place where they were able to harm you. And the ultimate outcome of a civil case is not incarceration, but it's compensation. And here's
Mhm.
where a lot of victims go, well, I don't want money. I don't want money. And I feel bad about the money. And I think a lot of times as Christians, a lot of my clients are at least coming out of that world. They feel like guilt, like I'm asking for money. And I say, well, let me just tell you something. The reality is this: healing from trauma is
Mm.
expensive.
It is.
Yeah.
And the reality too is if you're
And
a
it takes
child
time.
and you're healing, this healing could be a lifelong journey. You might need to
Yes.
be a therapist for 4 or 5 years, stop, and then something triggers you and you need to go back for 4 or 5 years. This could be an ongoing thing. And
Mhm.
why should you have to dig money out of your own pocket, or even if you don't have the money, go, I can't go to a therapist because I don't
Mhm.
have the means to do it. When you should be holding those responsible for putting you in this position legally accountable and making them pay for that. So to me, it's helping. To me, part of the civil process, unlike the criminal process, is helps to empower that client to, again, like I said earlier, to regain their voice and their agency. Whereas in a criminal case, and I think criminal cases are critically important. I think people who commit
Yeah.
these crimes should be prosecuted.
Yes.
Mhm.
But the trouble with victims in criminal cases is in the underlying crime, their voice was taken away by the perpetrator. Oftentimes, in the prosecution of the case, their voice is taken away, or their decision-making ability is taken away by the prosecutor. And Where in the civil case, it's like, no, this is your case. You are making these decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's going to be difficult, but I'm a firm believer. I've been doing this a long time. If I
Yeah.
work with my client long enough, they will be ready for their deposition.
Yeah.
They will be ready for their trial testimony. And it will be far, far less traumatic than the trauma that they've already experienced with the underlying abuse. And I think that's part of why this can be so healing for so many.
Yes,
Wow.
and I do want to just make this point. I think it's really important right now that the number one thing in all the research that I've read that will help a child to heal from an SA, regardless of if it was clergy or just in somewhere else in life, is that a parent steps forward and says this was wrong and actually brings the case forward. So when a child who has no ability to speak for themselves is represented, then that child feels like, oh, this abuse that happened to me was wrong. This was not right. And it draws a line in the sand for them that this was abuse. And then it allows them to say, I need to be healed from this.
And that's powerful, because why we're here is because we have voices of authority, and we want to use that voice to speak out for people. And we said at the beginning, this would be one of our more challenging conversations. And as we said in Project Heal, this is an ongoing conversation. Not perfect, but
Yeah.
thank you so much for being so direct with
Thank
us,
you.
Boz. Thank you
Thank
for
you, Boz.
opening so many people's eyes to this. Keep going. We're cheering you on. And I have one last question. I told you at
Yeah.
the beginning we'd have a little bit of moment of levity. So Sunday morning breakfast recommendation, Waffle House or IHOP?
Oh, without question, Waffle House.
Okay.
Yeah. And especially after what I dealt with IHOP, even the name gets me a little bit traumatized. So
I think it gets us traumatized too now.
Gotcha.
thank God there's not a church called Waffle House. Let's hope there never will be.
Well,
Thank
we
you
won't
both.
open one.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks
thank
a
you.
lot. We
And
really appreciate your time.
respect your work and what you've done. You've accomplished so much, and I can't imagine the amount of pushback you've had. And so we just genuinely want to say thank you for your work. We really deeply respect your work and the victims you've advocated for and protected. Thank you for watching Project Healed. Subscribe, join us. We've just started the conversation, and it's just going to get better from here.